Hey, everybody, welcome to the PC Perspective Podcast. This is episode 187, recorded on February 1st, 2012. I'm Ryan Schroep.
I'm Jeremy Hellstrom.
I'm Josh Walrath.
I'm Alan Malventano.
If you're watching the video version, I apologize for the horrible video quality and image quality and color quality coming through, but this is what happens when you are accidentally using your integrated camera on your laptop instead of anything external. So I am on location in, it's dark out, but it was sunny in San Jose to cover the AMD Financial Analyst Day tomorrow. So that explains my absence from the regular studio area, but let's go ahead and talk about stuff, I guess. We talk about hardware things on this podcast sometimes. I don't think we covered this last week. You guys could correct me if I'm wrong, on Matt's editorial about Ultrabooks.
Nope.
I do not believe we covered that.
Okay, all right. Thanks for all the feedback. Just titled Ultrabooks Intel
We're doing
Inopportune freeze, Ryan.
Now.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I'm not watching the video, so the humor passes me, guys. I'm on a single little tiny screen here. So he wrote an editorial on Ultrabooks and maybe why they weren't necessarily as perfect and as ideal.
Oh boy.
Or the push at CES. And now Alan is a proud user of an Ultrabook as well, so he may be able to chime in on some of this stuff. I'll encourage everybody to go and actually read this editorial. It was well put together. He's not like an Ultrabook hater, but he does mention some of the things that I think will concern a lot of users about Ultrabooks. They're skinny, but in order to meet the price requirements that Intel has while maintaining that thin profile, a lot of times they're using cheaper materials, and sometimes the screens can feel flimsy, the keyboards can flex more than you would like, those types of things. You're missing out on connections. Most Ultrabooks would be lucky if you have 2 USB ports and some kind of display output. Networking ports are gone. The ability to use this notebook as your primary computer might be degraded somewhat because of those lack of ports. Performance is a little bit
display.
Yeah. I mean, he says that most of the display qualities are fairly low compared to other notebooks. Now, keep in mind, there's kind of 2 levels of Ultrabook that we kind of refer to. The Ultrabook, they want to be able to bring all this out at a reasonable price. If they have to sell it at $1,500, it's not necessarily looking that great for Intel. But there are several manufacturers that are selling premium Ultrabooks, is what they're calling them, for those higher prices that include things like better screens or better keyboards or better physical materials so that they feel stronger, things like that. It's an interesting kind of article again, and he compares it in one way to like BTX. If you remember, Josh, what Intel did with the BTX, what they attempted to do with BTX, which was completely change the way systems were built in order to fit the hardware that they had at the time, which was the Pentium 4 processor, I believe. It didn't really pan out that well in the long run, right?
No, because some of the decisions that they made were very poor, especially in spacing of some of the when you started to get into some of the video cards that were longer than the standard at the time when they originally came in BTX. It caused a lot of issues, and so Intel they had to just stop supporting that because it just didn't work for hardware that started showing up later than what they had originally planned for.
And a lot of the comments in the story, since we've posted it last week, are kind of knocking on Matt for really hating on Ultrabooks. And he's not doing that, but I guess the concern he has, and the concern that I think is valid, is that if this is your only computer, it may not be as useful to consumers as Intel wants you to believe. He says in there that There are statistics that show the majority of laptops never leave the house. The majority of people who buy laptops aren't quote mobile users in the sense that they take their laptops with them everywhere they go, that they travel a lot. Think to you or your family. My mom and my sister, they have laptops as their only computer, but they don't really leave the house with them very often, if at all. It's just a convenient form factor to have. So when I recommend a Ultrabook for them versus a standard kind of 15-inch or 14-inch or maybe even a 17-inch laptop, it's going to offer a little bit better performance, a bigger screen, a higher resolution screen, maybe more connectivity options at the same kind of price level. It's a very interesting debate. I am personally interested in Ultrabooks because I do travel so much, and getting extended battery life and not having to carry around a 7-pound combination of machine and power brick would be really handy. So I encourage everybody to go over to PCPro.com and check out this editorial. It's called Ultrabooks. Intel knows what's good for you. You can go to the review section, or you can go to the mobile section to find it. Alan, I don't know if you had any quick comments since now you've been using an Ultrabook for the last couple of weeks.
I could make a comment on the construction. I'm looking at an Asus UX31, and while the screen is pretty good as far as how it's constructed, and it's not, it's surprisingly rigid for how thin the screen part of it itself is. But what I noticed is if you go to grab the body of the Ultrabook itself, if you grab it by like the front right corner, like where just to the right of the trackpad, for example, where you might just sort of grab by a corner and go to pick it up.
Yeah.
Which you tend to do with these because they're light and they're small-ish, right? So you don't really necessarily have to use two hands for it. But I picked it up by that corner a couple times, and then I set it down, and it wouldn't sit level anymore because it actually just the lower part of the chassis of the thing a
that's
little
not
bit,
good.
just from picking it up. It wasn't permanent. I was able to just sort of twist it back the other way, and
That doesn't sound good, Alan.
I know, right? It wasn't drastic, but it was enough. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was doing. I was like, oh, that's kind of weird, and I just sort of twisted it back the other way, and and then the screen closed completely flat again as well. That's what was funny. The screen didn't bend, but the big bulkier part of the bottom.
Yes, that's a pretty serious problem to have, and it's something that needs to be addressed, right? And like I'm saying, there are higher costs. I think the UX31 might be like a $900 or $999 Ultrabook option,
right?
Which is kind of in the middle there. If you get into the more expensive ones, have the abuse loading cost there.
Wow.
So
could you repeat that?
You might want to repeat what you just said.
Yeah.
Because it was.
You're doing a dance
fantastic.
remix version of it.
I think you were doing some dubstep there.
That's all it was. Just go read the article on the website.
Well,
And chime in the comments because it's becoming a good discussion.
Yeah. Let's move on past that and talk with Alan about the Patriot Pyro and Wildfire SSD review that you posted up. What controller? You've got this interesting subtext of IMFT async versus Toshiba toggle mode flash, and I don't really know a whole lot about exactly what that means. So, in a quick synopsis, tell us about these two products for Patriot.
Okay, so you have, in general, for SAM4 solid-state drives, you have Intel/Micron flash, right? That's the most popular stuff that's been out for a while now, right? It's either available in synchronous or asynchronous as far as its bandwidth, how it connects, how it talks to the controller. And then there's Toshiba makes this toggle mode flash, which is the other standard. It is not ONFI flash, which is what the IMFT stuff is. So it basically uses a different connection style, different protocol. And even though it keeps being touted as the fastest thing out there, it's actually async by how the actual connection works.
All right.
But for some things, for IOs per second, sometimes you can eke some more IOs per second out of a controller when you hook it up to this Toshiba flash instead of the Intel stuff. Just slight variations in how the communication works. So we had a couple of these drives, and one same controller. Basically everything was the same except for just using two different styles of flash. So it was a good way to take a look at sort of a head to head. And we did, but unfortunately the SandForce turned out to be more of the bottleneck with these two particular models, because they're using the stock firmware from SandForce as opposed to like any of the, where you're sort of used to the OCZ, which really does some heavy tweaking to their firmware, as far as performance and getting like maximum possible IOs per second out of it. Not just max IOs per second, but like in practice, like what actually shows up on some of our benches. So, unfortunately, the difference didn't look that big performance-wise for these two models. So what that left us with was looking at sort of at the prices. Like, okay, well, how much does the Pyro cost, which is the Intel, and how much does the Wildfire cost, which is the Toshiba? And the Wildfire ended up costing, was definitely a premium you were paying for those drives for the same capacities. So at the end of the day, it just sort of looked like, well, you should probably steer towards the Pyro for this one if you're going for either one or two of these, one or the other of these models. So I mean, we're not sure what'll come in the future. Everything is in the firmware, it seems, when it comes to the performance of these, and that's what this test specifically showed. The big deal was when we hit our, everything was pretty much the same. When you talk about just straight line speeds, that sort of thing, most of these controllers they pretty much max out the bus as it is. The difference came when we did our IO meter testing, which was where we have, basically it's everything all at once, right? There's certain percentages of different size writes going on. At the same time, you have certain percentages of different size reads going on. Everything's simultaneously happening. And then we ramp it up and pile even more commands on the drive simultaneously. That's how we tell how, a drive scales with like when you really hit it with heavy workloads. That's where these two drives really fell short compared to everything else, including other drives with the same SandForce controller, just with different, more tweaked firmwares. And they actually, both of them ended up towards the back of the pack, believe it or not. So there's definitely a disadvantage to those that are not tweaking the SandForce provided firmware for these things, as it turns out.
Interesting. Now I know we haven't posted it yet, but maybe up tomorrow. What's the next SSD review you have that's going to go live?
So we actually did another sort of a head-to-head for another couple of SandForce controlled drives, except these were Corsair. We looked at the Corsair Force 3 and the Corsair Force GT. Both of those are IMFT, but the difference is one of them is asynchronous flash and one of them is synchronous flash. So it's just a different configuration for how the communication to the flash memory goes. Those drives, same kind of performance thing as far as their stock SandForce firmware. That's not as good as some of the competitions. We saw those same kinds of traits with these drives. So the performance was really more along the lines of the two Patriot drives that we looked at just now. However, the Corsair drives are much more aggressive on their pricing, like big time aggressive on their pricing, like $1.30 a gig for a bunch of the different capacity points too. Like how usually there's a little dip where you can figure out, oh, there's the sweet spot. I can buy this drive for the cheapest cost per gig. Theirs is more like a band, like it just runs across three different capacities where you have just this $1.30 or $1.40 per gig for whichever capacity you're going. And then even when you go all the way up to like the 480 gig capacity of the Corsair Force 3, the cheaper version, it's like $1.40 a gig for a half a terabyte capacity. So that's pretty darn good. The pricing is they really stuck out at me there. And that pricing was actually way better than the equivalent offerings from Patriot. So they sort of have some catching up to do in pricing, I guess, as well.
All right, so look for that review probably to go up Thursday or Friday, depending on our scheduling. Another review that we did, this is kind of the big GPU release of the week. It seems like we're going to have a lot of these in the next 60 days or so. The AMD Radeon HD 7950. We've already talked about the HD 7970 quite a bit on the show and on the website. And you can basically think of the 7950 as the exact same GPU, subtracting four AMD compute units. So this core has 1,792 shader processors instead of 2,048 shader processors. And it has, I think, 8 fewer texture units or 16 fewer texture units, something like that. But what's interesting, so it retains much of the same compute power. It also retains the same 384-bit memory bus and 3 gigabyte frame buffer. So you are still getting the same 3 gigs of memory on this card, which is one of the big features of it compared to the competing like GTX 580s that almost all of them come with 1.5 gigs. So the clock speeds are also lowered a little bit, 800 megahertz reference instead of 925 megahertz reference. So you are going to see some performance differences in my benchmarking and testing in the review. We see anywhere from about a 15 to 20% is kind of like the average mid-range performance gap between the performance of the 7970 and the 7950. So it kind of puts it in perspective in terms of how the shaders and clock speed difference really affects kind of the product stack that AMD has. The main competitor for the 7950, though, is NVIDIA's GTX 580. And in my testing, I think we do 6 individual games and 3 other benchmarks. The 7950 is faster than the GTX 580 in, I think, 4 out of the 6 games, anywhere from 5 to 8 to as much as 10%, I think, in one of the titles. So it's close, but it's the performance lead is definitely with the AMD 7950. And because of that, the pricing kind of stacks up. The 7950 is going to be $450, and actually, I think you can actually find them for $450 as of we record this. And the GTX 580 kind of sells for $499. You can find it on sale sometimes for like $479, but average type of starting price is $499 for the reference design. So AMD has a card that's faster by a little bit and less expensive by a little bit, which is good. I still think it's still kind of, we're still trying to get used to the $450 card, the $550 card releases that we hadn't seen in quite some time, and I think most of us were kind of hoping wouldn't be the case. But we can't have it now. I guess and I'm not going to walk through each of the individual benchmarks on the podcast. You guys should check out the article for that. You know, we tested Battlefield 3 and Dirt 3 and Batman Arkham City and Metro 2033 and those types of things. One thing I will note is that AMD still has a lot of work to do on the Crossfire performance side of things. Of those 6 games that we tested, only Dirt 3, Metro 2033, and one other one that I'm skipping over right now.
He might have meant Battlefield 3.
Deus Ex, wasn't it?
One of those.
Deus
Batman,
Ex
Metro,
had some
and Deus
weird
Ex.
dips in it, but
Did
Batman was one of these games that didn't scale at all. Battlefield 3 scaled at 1680 and 1920, but not at 2560 resolution.
25,
yeah, which is a weird bug to have at all, and it's the same bug that existed with the 7970 release as well. So single car performance drivers work correctly. The dual GPU scaling is great, but that's like saying this car is an awesome car if the engine ran. Like these are, you can't have one without the other. You can't say, well, Crossfire scales great when it works, because one of the whole selling points of multi-GPU gaming is that it just works, right? You don't have to configure things. You don't have to wait months and months for your particular manufacturer to get drivers ready. NVIDIA is not perfect in that regard at all, but they are much better at kind of releasing drivers day of. You know, they had drivers out day of for Battlefield 3, for Skyrim, for Battlefield 3, I meant, not Dirt 3. So we got to put some pressure on AMD for that they need to kind of catch up in that regard.
Well, you know what I think is kind of going on there? Excuse me. Is that, they've been optimizing drivers for the HD 6000 series, and suddenly they finally got all these new cards thrown upon their laps for the 7000 series. I think essentially they just dropped everything that they were doing to try to get something that works for this new silicon that they're getting, because GCN is a big jump from what they previously were, the VLIW4. VLIW4 from VLIW5 was not as big of a jump because the hardware kind of handled a lot of the issues that you saw with that. But in the GCN, it's a pretty big difference between the two architectures. So I'm thinking they pulled a lot of people off of the Catalyst group, not so much to stay away from Catalyst, but to optimize for the new architecture that's coming out and to make sure that they had a product that at least worked a little bit as compared to, hey,
Right.
they've got really good support for the HD 6000 series, but boy, these new cards suck with Batman and Skyrim and all these other things when you're running one of these single cards, everything seems to work pretty well, correct? Or were there a couple of big glaring issues?
With single cards?
Yeah.
I didn't have any issues. I haven't had any issues with the 7970 to 7950 and single card performance at all.
Yeah, so
It's
you
worked
kind of
really
look
well.
at it, and you know that that AMD has a much smaller group than NVIDIA when it comes to driving for coding for drivers and software. So yeah, they probably just had to move a lot of people around, change their workloads to make sure that, hey, most people are going to buy a single one of these. Let's make sure we give them the best experience possible. And I'm not trying to make excuses for AMD. They should probably have, more people working on software because, how many times did you do a review over the past, I'd say 9 months where AMD seemed to have issues with these brand new games. NVIDIA didn't. But then again, AMD was the first to come out with this new architecture. So am I connecting the dots well, or am I out?
Yeah. Probably. No, I mean, I'm not 100% sure myself, but I think you're probably right. They have a smaller team. They wanted to focus on getting all the performance they could out of a single card, but it's not enough, right? They
They gotta
had
be
set the
better.
boundary. I think it was a year ago where AMD came out with this. It's been 18 months since AMD came out with the what do they call their program? Their Gaming Evolved
Their
program, where they guarantee.
manifesto.
Yeah, exactly. The Gaming Manifesto, where they said we're going to do this, and we're going to make sure gamers get the best of this, and blah 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 blah. And it doesn't mean squat to just say.
No, they're
you
still
have-
on the. We're going to release a driver a month, whether it matters or not. Whether it fixes or breaks it doesn't matter.
They
Every
tend to
month we're
release
gonna
more
put out a
than
new
one driver a month recently, and
Well-
they tend to be broken with broken links and all
That's a new
kinds of
habit.
other issues as well. It's it's unfortunate because they have a really good product, and in some ways the software is holding it back onto the multi GPU side. But like Josh is kind of pointing out, with the single GPU side, it's not really an issue. The last thing I'll say about the 7950 before we move on is it did have a lot of overclocking headroom. I was able to actually run ours at 1050 megahertz, which is like a 31% increase over the 800 megahertz reference speed, which is really nice. Completely stable, no voltage modifications, no power modifications or anything like that. And that almost put it right on the edge of performance of a 7970 when we did that. So, if you're looking to save $100 and you're comfortable, I mean, the only thing we used for overclocking was the integrated AMD Overdrive stuff in the Catalyst Control Center. So we just drug a slider bar to 1050 after a couple steps in between, and we were able to run games stable for hours and hours at that clock speed without an issue. So,
And maybe one day we'll be able to
Yeah, I
flash it into a real 7970.
I'm sure AMD hopes that's not the case, but I don't know. Actually, at this point, they may not care. They may just say, "Please buy one of these products."
And that could certainly
it-
happen a couple of months down the line if some of the rumors about Kepler and those products come out to be true, where NVIDIA has a smaller chip, a faster chip, pulls less power, and is overall a better product. So, yeah, if you remember when the 6950s were originally released, I mean, the first thing out of the blocks was, hey, you had this BIOS switch. Could do performance or stock, and the next thing you know, you have all these BIOSes available that unlock those shaders. So I really wonder if AMD is going to go that route again this time, because boy, the 6950 was a tremendous product for the time for people who wanted to take the risk on unlocking all those extra shaders.
Indeed. So check out the review at obviously at the website. We have a video review of it as well as the full text review. So look at all that kind of stuff. It's a really, really good card. So far, stock seems to be holding up a little bit better than the 7970 did at launch day. So that's a plus. But we'll talk about
I think Ryan should be fired, and he needs to no longer stay in cheap Super 8 motels with bad wireless.
I'm not using their internet though. I am using a Verizon 4G LTE device that is apparently failing.
You're fired.
The worst part is I hear you guys like you have never skipped once for me. Like I've never heard any of the issue at all from you guys. So
If only you could hear yourself.
I guess. Anyway, we'll take our quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk with Josh again, unfortunately, but about video cards. So that's good news. All right, thank you, MSI. Josh, let's talk to you about the Asus Direct. Are we calling this Direct CU? Direct Copper?
Yeah, I call it Direct CU. Direct Q sounds kind of silly.
It does.
But anyway,
so
Direct
you took a look at 3 graphics cards from Asus in the NVIDIA front. Tell us a little bit about them and kind of what your thoughts were.
Okay, I like video cards. It's
yeah,
it's. I think everybody does. There are like 2 sexy things in the computer world: new CPUs and new video cards. Motherboards, yeah, they're kind of interesting. Sure, Alan likes SSDs and some hard drives, but the vast majority of us, we don't really care. I mean, look at the wild eye that Alan is giving when talking about SSDs. The man obviously has issues. If you can look at the trophies behind him, I'm not going to go into how he earned those, but use your imagination. But anyway, Asus, they sent out a bunch of cards to me. And unfortunately, things have gone really horrific in the past 6 months. And I would like to use any excuse I possibly can, but in the end, excuses are bad. But I just was unable to get to them and review them as properly as I could until after Christmas break. So anyway,
right.
they sent a bunch. 3 of them on the NVIDIA side were the ENGTX 560 Ti tops, which is an overclocked card. It's basically a GTX 560. It's overclocked to 900 megahertz, so it's about 78 megahertz faster than a stock product. They also sent me the ENGTX 570 and the ENGTX 580. Now, DirectCU is all in relation to the cooling they have. They totally are stepping away from the stock reference coolers of both NVIDIA and AMD for a lot of their higher-end parts. They feel that the DirectCU is in relation to how they cool the chip, which is they have in between 3 to 5 heat pipes that directly sit on top of the GPU and provide, and distribute the heat to 2 separate little, heat sinks underneath the shroud that we see in the picture right there. And so they're hoping that the dual fan setup with this, kind of niftier, heftier cooling will provide some real world benefits for users. The first one I took a look at was the 560 Ti. This is probably my most favorite card of the entire bunch. It retails for $249, but obviously there are usually rebates. It's not a totally ducted system, and so only a portion of the air comes out of this back, and then some of the other comes leaking out the sides, which is perfectly fine because the vast amount of air, if you've got a decent case, it's not going to matter much. It's not going to increase your system temperatures to any significant degree. The coolers by themselves are efficient enough that they whisk heat away quickly enough that it doesn't become an issue, and that there's no real hot spots. It doesn't become a massive radiator. So this is it's a pretty fast card. We were very familiar with the GTX 560 Ti. This one again is overclocked out of the box to 900 megahertz, and it's a pretty smoking fast card. If you work in resolutions of 1920 by 1200 and below, this is a great buy for the price. It keeps incredibly cool. I believe it reached a maximum of 7 degrees centigrade at full load. At just idle, it was sitting around 35 degrees.
Wow.
Heat and noise is not an issue. It's got two 70 millimeter fans on there, not as big as the other models that I'm about to show you, but for this particular product, it's it's probably my favorite card of the group because it does what it's supposed to do. It's a good price performance. It stays cool. It stays quiet. It has a nice amount of features there. Unfortunately, with most NVIDIA, with all NVIDIA cards except some of the specialty ones that you have reviewed lately, they can only handle 2 video outputs at a time. So even if you use, 2 DVI, you're not going to be able to use the HDMI, the mini HDMI cable.
Right.
It's just the way it goes. I mean, you're limited to a max of 2 displays with one of these cards. If you want to get more than that, you have to have them in SLI. So you got to make sure that you have an SLI enabled motherboard to be able to run that. Otherwise, NVIDIA has been striding ahead in terms of software. I think they are a step above AMD for the reasons that we had mentioned before. They for a while there, I think if you remember about 3 years ago, Jensen Huang came out and said, we're only going to have 4 releases a year, 1 a quarter, and it's going to cover everything. And within 6 months, they're saying, okay, well, here's this beta that we're trying to get out. And I think that they've come to the realization that it's going to be a constant development because there are so many new games, so many really popular games coming out. 2011 was just, amazing for the products that came out in the software world. But this pretty much runs it all at ultra levels at least 1920 by 1200 and below. It's got a 1 gig frame buffer, and that kind of limits it when you go to 2560 by 1600. It just is too much swapping for a lot of these modern games. I mean, sure, if you were to do the math and say, hey, 2560 by 1200 at 32 bits and X amount of Z buffer, I mean, that's only going to take up like 256 megs. But most of the games that we have now, it's going to have so much geometry and texture data that are stored on board the board itself that it's starting to run out with a lot of these, very latest titles, especially the higher end stuff. Metro 2033, that's still real high end. Dirt 3, I believe. I saw some, significant changes in there. So, otherwise, if you're in that kind of range of resolution and price, the EN GTX 560 Ti top is really a good product. Got the gold award from me. I really enjoyed it. Now, the other 2 cards were the 570 and 580. And, this is a massive card. I mean, it may not... Here's the previous one, the 560, right below it.
Oof.
And it's significantly smaller. And what is really significant is girth. Yes, it may not be exceptionally long, but the girth of this new card is massive. It's a 3-slot cooling solution, and if you do not have the space in your case, you're going to want to do something else. Now, obviously, they've done a few things with this. They've added a display port as compared to a full-size HDMI. Well, that HDMI right there. Again, you're limited to 2 outputs, but both the 570 and 580 are about the same size here. I've got the 580 right here. And just to compare it to the previous monster, the oh god, I'm breaking everything apart here. This is the MSI N580 GTX. The bottom one's a little bit longer, but again, when you're talking about length versus girth, Asus has them whipped. And you talk to any woman, and they will tell you the same thing. Anyway, going from there, cooling performance on all these cards, DirectCU does work. It works pretty well. I mean, when you compare in the article to the temperatures of the MSI products versus this, they're about the same. But unfortunately, MSI does it in 2 slots versus the DirectCU 3. But again, it's up to you. If you want to run multiple of these cards, if you're going to try to do Tri-SLI with these cards, you're going to have a really massive case, because that's going to take up 9 slots total. So it's a design decision that I was not always 100% behind for Asus. I mean, they're trying to do something different. It is effective. It cools very, very nicely. But, it just takes up a lot of space. And I think only the NZXT 810 Swift, it's got enough space for triple SLI in these. It's, for the 580, all these cards overclock really, really well. I think I took the 560 Ti over a gigahertz, the 570 with a little voltage modification, it goes over a gigahertz. The 580 went up to something like 960
Nice.
gigahertz. And all these significant overclock for these particular cars. And so, Asus has done a fantastic job in designing them, implementing them, and getting them out to buyers. They're all still available right now as compared to the MSI N580 GTX Extreme Edition. You cannot find it anywhere. They just stopped producing it. You can't buy them. You can still do that with the Asus products. The only problem, of course, we have with at least the GTX 580, not so much with the 570 and the 560, because those are still priced very, very nicely for their performance and what they offer you. But of course, the GTX 580, you've now got the HD 7950 sitting right below it in terms of price, and it's giving as much or a little bit better performance. So people need to ask themselves, well, do I want a slightly faster card, but I've got to deal with these driver issues that I'm seeing, or do I want something that is still as fast, it's got good cooling, it runs nicely, and it's got the power of the NVIDIA driver team right behind it. So whenever I have some title like Skyrim, when it came out, how many issues were there with the AMD cards versus NVIDIA?
Ask Jeremy.
Yeah, Jeremy, how was that?
I was so happy to play the slideshow, which was Skyrim, to actually turn on speed step on the CPU, so that while I'm playing Skyrim, I can actually bring out the process monitor and notice that the CPU is slowed down because it isn't being asked to do anything, and my video card is at almost idle. Thanks, guys. Yeah. I really appreciated that. And your new patch broke the VSync again.
Nice. So, yeah, Asus is still sitting in a position where they can sell these cards because the quality of the environment around them. But overall, I was very happy with all of them. I have been testing them for months, literally, and I've never had a problem with them. They never got loud. They never got overly hot. Even when overclocking them, they did not become disturbing in terms of the sound coming out or the heat output. Asus has done a fantastic job engineering these cards, and they work exactly as they're supposed to. The prices are a little bit higher, but they're not extraordinary, and I think that you get what really you paid for in terms of quality, overclocking ability, and with the NVIDIA parts, you've got a pretty good software side behind you. So, it was a long time in coming with these reviews, but they were worth it. But boy, it just absolutely amazing how stinking thick these cards are. If you couldn't see any, light between them, you can just stack them up as bricks and build a house. A really stinking expensive house, but very still, these things are just massive,
nice,
and solid.
Well done,
and
sir.
Good luck trying to get SLI to work.
Yeah.
because it's not going to fit. Sorry.
Yeah,
Maybe
check your
if enough
motherboard
KY
support first.
was used, we can get them to fit. But
So on that note, let's move on. Talk about a handful. By the way, you could read all about Josh's girth in the full review at PCPro.com. Let's talk about a couple of other news items before we jump out of here today. First off is the Raspberry Pi Linux computer. Who has read about this? Who wants to talk about the amazing $35 hand-sized computer, palm-sized computer? Nobody.
Well,
You're all
all right,
just-
fine. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful example of why it is that ARM is really a threat on so many different levels. It's not funny. You've got what is this chipset you probably never heard of, which is a Broadcom BCM 2835. But the thing is, it's got the ARM 11 CPU, and it's got this interesting little thing called the Video Core 4 graphics card coprocessor. Really, that's what stands out about the Raspberry Pi, because, I mean, we have yet to sort of see it hands-on to know exactly whether or not it's true, but what they're claiming is that it's about twice as fast as the iPhone 4S's Power VR, which would be, fairly impressive. So they're talking
For a
about
$35 motherboard solution. Yeah, absolutely.
you'll be playing 1080p Blu-ray movies completely smoothly. And if you've tried doing that on your iPhone 4S, I'm guessing that it didn't quite work out well, especially considering you don't have 1080p display anyways.
Right.
And good luck
It's-
outputting it.
It's interesting looking at the picture of the motherboard on this. It's got Ethernet, it's got USB, it's got audio output. I think that's even like a digital coax audio output as well.
Yep.
I mean, it's we talked about this last week on Twitch, and I thought, and my comment was for $35. This is something where you buy 5 of them and have them in the house in case one dies, and if somebody came out with a way to connect it to a TV or a display or a monitor, I would just stick a piece of industrial Velcro on the back of it and tape it to the back of a monitor, right? And
You don't have to worry
plug
about
in the
cooling
display
or
output.
anything. It'd be happy sitting
Yeah.
back there.
Yeah, exactly. This is pretty impressive stuff. I have my doubts about them actually releasing it and selling it at that price.
Well, that's
We'll
the
see.
expensive model.
Yeah, there's a $25 model that doesn't have Ethernet, right? So, but I mean, there's like a port so you can get integrated Wi-Fi and that kind of stuff as well. HDMI output. I mean, it's really impressive piece of hardware, and you really need to see the picture of it to see how small it is, because you can see kind of where the HDMI port is and the USB and Ethernet ports are. That basically, on the width of it, they could only get the Ethernet and USB ports before they had to turn the corner and start putting connections on other stuff. It's a pretty interesting little device. Have they said anything about when they might actually sell these?
Coming soon to a place near you, hopefully. I haven't really seen much in the way of
Yeah.
information about whether this is going to actually be retailed or not, or if you're going to be buying, a fairly inexpensive HTPC with this inside of it.
Right. Interesting.
hey, did you notice that Kermit came around and he waved his hand and he said, "Hey, Burke."
No.
No. Oh, that's Ernie. God damn it. Sorry. Burke, I'm sorry. It was
Good try.
Jeremy, while you're on here, it was worth a shot. It was worth a shot. Hey, swing and a miss.
not
That's
really-
okay.
It's poorly done.
Jeremy, tell me about ARM's profits. We talked about Intel last week and A&B last week. We wouldn't want to leave out ARM since we just talked about the Raspberry Pi. Tell me a little bit about what their results will kind of look like.
Well, they're actually looking ridiculously good, unless you're actually counting raw dollars, in which case Intel just scares everyone, because that's a lot of billions. But they actually pulled in about, it's in pounds, 137.8 million pounds. Thing is that's over 20% increase from last year's. If you don't bother with the GAAP and adjusting for taxes and everything, they actually half again, 50% growth from last year. Because ARM is, I don't want to say open source because that's not exactly the right way to put it, but they don't lock people down into contracts. They don't say, if you're going to buy from ARM, you have to be from this manufacturer. No, they don't care who makes the ARM. They just license the process. You can make it. Samsung can make it. Anyone can make it. No problems. And if you're going to stick it onto a motherboard, well, you don't have to make sure that it's an ARM coprocessor and an ARM this and that like Intel loves to do. Right. They're perfectly happy to coexist with everything, which is probably why there were 2.2 billion ARM-powered chips sold last year. They are in your fridges. They are in your cars. They are in your fancy little tiny HTPCs. They're in your phones. They're in the bloody iPhone. So now ARM is competing against itself. It's a beautiful spot for them to be in. It's, the biggest processor no one's ever heard of. Guaranteed you probably own at least...
They started out with the processors and I.O. devices, just very small, very simple things that just were in everything that had to have any kind of data transport.
And they never abandoned that either.
It's amazing.
They're still selling those, and they're still selling the dual-core Cortex A9s and A11s.
There's no point in them not, because they're not really selling anything. They're just selling licenses at that point, right? They're not selling a product, so they get the benefit there. It's like, yeah, you want to make that part still? Sure, just pay me $20 for every 5 of them you make, or whatever it is, right? Or for every 20 you make, that type of thing. So pretty interesting stuff.
You have a fabless chip company. That's them.
Right.
Always has a productless chip company.
Yeah, more or less.
Essentially, yeah. The other kind of interesting news of the week is, since we just talked about the Radeon 750, the rumors are now of the Radeon 7700 and 7800 series release dates leaking to the web. Let's see. Tim wrote up this news post and says, it looks like AMD will not be wasting any time. They, where am I missing March the dates 6th. In this post? March 6th for, okay, that's CeBIT time frame. So that kind of makes sense. And that's for the 7800 series. And then for the 7700 series, they're actually saying February 15th, which is two short weeks.
2 weeks.
It's kind of interesting that they would release it. If this is true, they would release the 7700 series and then the 7800 series instead of 79, 78, 77. I don't know exactly why they would want to do that necessarily. But the 7700 part is kind of rumored in the $100 to $160 price range, according to this report. And I'll be very curious to see, I've been impressed with the 7970 and 7950 so far and how they have taken over kind of the super high-end graphics market, but that's still not high volume. And $100 to $160 part is super high volume. And my kind of idea, my impression was that they were releasing the higher end stuff first because they were giving TSMC time to kind of catch up with all the runs of 28 nanometer stuff that they needed to get done, so they could have enough inventory. And kind of as TSMC's capacity increases, so then would AMD's product line. But if they're going to go straight from the 7900 series to the 7700 series, I think that actually indicates that maybe they have a little bit more faith in what TSMC is doing on the 28 nanometer side. Josh, any thoughts?
Well, yeah. Of course I have thoughts. Good Lord, man. It kind of makes sense the way that they're doing this, because obviously I would say that AMD probably developed the 7700 chips first. It was the simpler product. They probably started running those through and starting to build them up and to make sure everything works. Then they put the 7900s in there, knowing that this would be a part that would still sell well, but it would not have the volume of the 7800 and 7700. So you got the 7700 being the first developed, the first put through the fab and starting to build up product. And then they, tweaked out some things and made sure everything's working. They did the bigger chips. And then, it's all kind of a balance of what they think they're going to sell and what they're going to order in terms of wafers. And so it does kind of make sense that this is going to be where it's at, because the 7800 is in between die sizes of those two and it's going to have, more product sold than the 7900, but not as much as the 77. So it all just kind of evened out. They probably got their number crunchers in there saying, hey, if we do it this way, we can maximize our actual wafer production. And with the yields that we are seeing per millimeter squared, this is going to be our best choice in how we order these wafers and get them out of the fab and get them packaged and out. So, yeah, you really hit the market hard with the 7900, and then you undercut everybody else in the competition with these lower end parts, and then you kind of deliver the final hopefully blow to the competition with these mid range parts that totally lays waste to their entire product stack. So yeah, it makes sense in how AMD has done this, and it's kind of neat once you start thinking about it. Some of the strategies behind it, or at least what I think the strategies are behind it. As far as I know, somebody flipped a coin at Sunnyvale or Austin, and hey, this is what we're going to go with.
Interesting. The last thing we'll mention is, as I said at the beginning of the show, I am out in Sunnyvale to kind of cover the AMD Financial Analyst Day that is tomorrow. It's probably over by the time you're listening to this if you aren't listening to it live. But you could, if you are listening to this live, you can go to pcper.com and sign up to get notified for our live blog that I'll be doing from the Financial Analyst Day. It should be the reason I'm attending this one as opposed to previous Analyst Days is we expect quite a bit of announcement on their roadmap and scheduling because they have had such dramatic shifts inside the company, both in terms of personnel and product lines. So if you are interested in that, stop by pcper.com at 9 a.m. Pacific, where Josh and I will comment on what AMD's executives are standing up there and saying. So
I may even say appropriate things at the time.
Hopefully appropriate things. All right, let's get to our hardware software picks of the week. I am taking the easy route out and recommending to you the new Radeon HD 7950 with a caveat. Do not buy this card if you are a 1080p gamer. If all you're going to do is game on a single display at 1080p, I do not think you need to spend $450 on a 7950. People who should buy this card are people who either have a 30-inch monitor today, have an Eyefinity configuration today, or want to go into an Eyefinity configuration in the not-too-distant future. In those cases, I think the 7950 and 7970 are the best cards on the market. They offer great features. They have great power consumption. And I have at least some confidence that they will fix the Crossfire issue down the road as well. The Crossfire, kind of the various Crossfire issues. So I found on Newegg, Sapphires is actually selling at $449. There are a couple for $469. There's a couple for $479, and then there's a couple at $489 that are overclocked, although not by a whole lot. Nice, but basically just kind of the standard ones. So,
did you ever watch Spirited Away? You sound like that guy with the ghost face.
I'm good at that. So anyway,
can under your desk or something slathered in mineral oil.
Really, we're gonna have to get you to stop that.
Okay.
The police are gonna show up one day. It's not gonna
or
be
at least
funny.
Ken's mom.
Jeremy, will you please go next so Josh doesn't talk again?
Oh, I am so torn right now. I really wish that I could skip on this podcast. In fact, I wish I was skipping next podcast, not because of work, but because anyone remember a game called Jagged Alliance? Specifically Jagged Alliance 2. Well, they finally released the demo today for Jagged Alliance Back in Action. I really hope that they didn't screw this game up because this is one of my fond memories. I played that game through so many times. I actually managed to beat it with just Shadow and myself at one point. And so it's out there. The Steam link doesn't seem to be working, but you can find it very easily from other places. Josh, I think Ryan wants to go to dinner.
What do you got?
All right. I found this and I saw we talked about the smaller brother of this last week, but I found the larger one, and it's on sale for $770 off.
Ooh.
It is the Samsung MD230X6 black 23-inch 1920 by 1080. 6 monitors, all in one stand, ultra thin bezels for the low price of $2880. It's
That's
$770 off. I'm
$480 a
serious.
display.
You like your display? Hey, dog, I hear you like your display, so I put more displays on your display.
$480 a piece for those 23-inch monitors, if you kind of
love
average it out.
Love it.
When are you getting the review unit, Ryan?
Yeah, hopefully they're sending it right now. Alan, what do you got for us?
I'm going to pick the
Good.
Corsair Force 3. Basically, whichever model you can find at Newegg, because almost all of them are just way cheap. Like, way cheap. Actually, there's a 60 gig model that's $80 after rebate.
Oh,
Yeah, that's like $80 for a 60 gig SandForce drive. That's not bad at all. And I think the sweet spot was like the 180, which is 250. So 180 gig for 250. 120 gigs like 170. Those are all just really good prices for SandForce.
Cool. All right, people who need SSDs, take a look. So that's going to wrap up the show. And hopefully, while I'm talking right now, we will go into stutter mode because I'm mentioning the word stutter. No?
sorry.
Did you do it?
No, you're looking clean,
Damn.
or at least well bathed.
So we didn't have emails or voicemails this time just because we were in a hurry. 1-888-38-PC-PER and podcast at PCPer.com are the ways to contact us. PCPer.com/podcast. And then all of the various websites where you can find us at /PCPer, Twitter.com/PCPer, Facebook.com/PCPer, and the bane of my existence, gplus.to/PCPer. So that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks everybody for listening. I'm Ryan Shrout.
I'm Jeremy Hellstrom.
I'm Josh Walrath.
And I'm Al Alventano.
Talk to you next week.